Alright guys, so here we have a question on the induction chapter. So what we have here, we have a square coil. So since they say it's a square, we assume it's a square despite it looking like a rectangle. So it's a square coil. It has a length and it's tightly wound with 200 turns of wire. So like you have one wire like this, and then on top of that wire you have another wire, and on top of that second wire you have another wire until you have 200 wires stacked on top of each other. That's what this diagram is showing us. And then we've been given the resistance of the coil, and more specifically the magnetic field is perpendicular to the surface of this coil, of this square coil. So if we were to draw it like in 2 dimensions, this is what it would look like. You'd have this square coil flat on top of your tablet or on your computer screen. And these are 200 turns specifically of the square coil, and then your magnetic field is pointing into the coil. So this is the notation we use for into your computer screen or into your tablet or into your phone. So that's basically the magnetic field vector. This is some sort of external magnetic field that we are shining on this square coil that happens to be metallic. And since it's metallic, it's a really good conductor because it has some free valence electrons that it wants to give away. So because of that chemistry, the chemistry behind it with electrons, or the science behind it, we eventually get a current that's going to be flowing. That's kind of the theoretical idea behind square coils and these types of questions. Now, going further into the question, so the magnetic field itself is decreasing at a rate of negative 0.040 teslas per second. And now we're being asked, what is the magnitude of the EMF induced in the coil? So again, by shining an external magnetic field on a square coil, you are creating a current, or you're creating an electromotive force that is going to cause a current because of Ohm's law. The electromotive force being equal to the current times the resistance. So that's the theoretical idea behind this stuff. Now, to actually solve the question, in this question we need two formulas. The first one's for the magnetic flux. The second one's for the electromotive force. And then, of course, for the second question, right, you want to find the current circulating through the coil. So, of course, we'd use Ohm's law. So, V is equal to IR, or E is equal to IR. The E, it's not an actual E there. I think it's called omega or epsilon. I forgot. It's just some sort of Greek letter that looks like an E. So we start with solving for the magnetic flux. To get the area of the square coil, we already have the length, and we know that it's a square. So the area of a square is always length times width, but we know that the width and the length are the same thing for a square, so it's really just length times length, which is length squared. Okay, now there's an area vector or a normal vector. The area vector and the normal vector are the same thing. I'm just going to call it the normal vector. The area vector for the square coil is always perpendicular to the square coil. So the area vector for any coil is always perpendicular to its surface at 90 degrees. So now I can choose a direction. I can say that the area vector or the normal vector can point into the square coil or out of the square coil. For simplicity's sake, I'll say it points into the square coil. So maybe I should use a different color. There we go. So it's pointing with the magnetic field, essentially. This is something I've assumed. Again, even if your assumption this is the normal vector, or you can also call it a hat, but I'll just call it n hat. So again, this is something you assume in these types of questions. Again, even if there's no such thing as a wrong assumption. If we assume that it's pointing in this direction, like out of the page, out of your tablet screen, then that would also be fine. It's just that when you calculate the current, you might get a negative answer. It doesn't mean that your choice was wrong. It just means that in your case, the current was actually flowing in the opposite direction, since it had a negative sign. Since you got a negative sign for the current in the answer. Look, the simple thing is, it doesn't matter whether you choose the area vector to point out of the page or into the page. That's all I'm saying. Now to actually start solving for the magnetic flux, we basically have area of the square times the magnetic field cosine of the angle between them. In my case, we have the area, which is L squared, times n hat. N hat represents the area vector, times the magnetic field itself. Cosine of the angle between them, cosine of 0. In my case, the angle is 0 degrees. Between this angle represents the angle between the area or the normal vector and the magnetic field vector. The angle between them is 0. They're both like parallel to each other and pointing in the same direction. So clearly I'm going to just get my calculator, but cosine of 0, I believe it should give 1. Yeah, so there we go. So that's just a 1. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm not going to plug in the actual numbers. And here's why. Because I don't need to necessarily find the magnetic flux itself directly. I just need to find the EMF, and the EMF requires me to get the derivative of the magnetic flux, not the magnetic flux itself. So that's why I would just sort of simplify this equation as much as I can. Like I put a 0 degree angle and just got rid of the cosine because of it. I just got a 1. So I'm just going to kind of simplify the formula, then take its derivative and directly jump into finding the EMF. But it's just plug and play, these problems. And once you get like the concept behind it, it's plug and play. So you have L squared times the dot product of the n vector and the magnetic field vector, or the area vector. So there we go, we kind of have the simplified version. Instead of calling, there we go, so n hat and then the magnetic field vector. So that's a simplified form of the equation. Now I'll just do EMF is equal to, I'll use this formula, so minus n, minus 200 turns. And then I'm just going to take the derivative of that equation I found for the magnetic field, which is just L squared times the normal vector dotted with the magnetic field vector. So what do I know? I know that the magnetic field is decreasing at a certain rate, so that's great, and everything else is constant. So the area is constant, the area of the coil is constant, and the angle between the area vector or the normal vector and the magnetic field vector is also constant. So that's great. So the only thing that can be changing from what I have seen in this problem is definitely the magnetic field. So what that means is that I can take the derivative of these two guys, it's not a problem. But the derivative of this guy, I can take it, but it has a value to it. Actually, no, scrap that. What I'm trying to say is that when I take the derivative of the magnetic field, I get it's the magnetic field itself is changing, like we've seen before up there. While basically the length squared and the n hat vector are just constants. So when you take the derivative of a constant or a number, basically, you can just use the constant rule for derivatives. So it kind of just, you don't really, what you basically get is negative 200 times L squared n hat. So hold on, I've made a mistake. The equation for the let me erase all this. I need to explain to you something specific that I forgot to explain. The equation for the magnetic flux is the dot product between the area vector and the magnetic field vector, or also known as the magnitude of the area times the magnitude of the magnetic field and times the cosine of the angle between these two vectors. We're using this equation, so we should not have any vectors in there in the first place, and that's the mistake I'm making. I kind of had a bit of a, let's say, a bit of a brain fart. So again, coming back to the same thing, we have L squared times the magnetic field. Cosine of the angle between them was 0, as we mentioned before, so that gives us a 1. So we have L squared times the magnetic field, B. Now the magnetic field is changing, so it's changing with respect to time, B of t. It's a function, and it's changing according to this thing. So yeah, now I plug this into the following equation, negative 200, like I did before, take the derivative with respect to time of that expression that I just found. So yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. You don't plug everything in immediately. You don't plug the numbers in immediately. You take the derivative of the expression once you've simplified it a bit, of the basically the magnetic, what's it called? This thing, what was it? Of the magnetic flux, there we go. So this is a constant. L is 0.25 meters. That's the length, right, squared. So it's just going to get factored out. Or we basically use the constant rule, is what I'm trying to say. So we have 0.25 meters squared. So we use the constant rule for derivatives, and that is just a constant, so it goes out. And now we're taking the actual derivative of B of t. To simplify this thing, it's just the derivative of the magnetic field. Or this, to make it clear for you what's going on. So there we go. Now we know what the derivative of the magnetic field is. It's this value. So it's negative 0.040 teslas per second. So now I'll just plug this into my calculator, and hopefully we found the that gives me 0.5 volts. 0.50 volts. And it's positive. So basically, when I use Ohm's law, I'll get a positive value for the current. So it basically means that, yeah, the current was indeed flowing. Or rather, I guess I managed to make the correct assumption. Well, it doesn't really matter. I wouldn't say correct assumption, but I mean, it just gave me a positive answer, which is a good thing. A negative answer isn't a bad thing either. It's also a good thing. So yeah, that's the induced EMF in the coil. That's question 1 for us. Now, to find the current circulating through the coil, we just use EMF is equal to IR, Ohm's law, and we have the resistance of the square coil. So we just have to plug these values in. That's 0.50 volts. The resistance of the coil is 5.0 ohms. So there we go. That gives me 0.1 amperes, and there we go. That basically solves this question. Now, if we had assumed that the area vector was pointing in the opposite direction of the magnetic field, but still parallel to it, as in this angle would have been 180 degrees, and we would have had a negative answer here, a negative sign here, which would have carried over and made this expression negative. So the EMF, the induced EMF, would be negative. And because the induced EMF is negative, we would have a negative answer for the current. It just means that the current was actually flowing in the opposite direction. So basically, when I use the right-hand rule along with the area vector, assuming that you're watching this on your tablet and your tablet is flat on the table in front of you, your thumb points straight down into the ground and you curled your fingers into a fist. And so we're saying that the current is going to be flowing clockwise, which is what we assumed. And so we got that positive current, the positive answer for the current. Now, basically, what I was saying is, so basically your current is, since the magnetic field is getting weaker, the current is trying to strengthen the magnetic field. I believe this is Lenz's law, basically. So yeah, the current is trying to strengthen the magnetic field because it wants to survive. It's just a game of survival. The current wants to survive. And if there's no magnetic field, then there's no EMF, induced EMF. And if there's no induced EMF, there is no current. And the current is just trying to survive. So it's realizing, oh my god, the magnetic field is dying. Let me strengthen it so I can live longer. I can live a long